Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. I will be in your company for the next 45 to 50 minutes. Now, 369 years ago, in this month of April, a ship was spotted off the Cape Agulhas coast. That ship belonged to the Dutch East India Company, and it carried a very famous figure, famous or infamous, however you want to see it, in the name of Jan van Riebeeck. Now, it all sounds like a lovely fairy tale story, a story that you'd read to your children in your bedtime, or a story you would give during your secondary education. Well, of course, it wasn't that much of a fairy tale. It laid the roots for colonialism to take its place. It laid the roots for exploitation of the indigenous people to take place, and it laid the roots for the exploitation of the black Africans, which would go right through to apartheid, and of course we would see the dawn of democracy in 1994. But that day in 1652 had begun what we would call the beginning of colonialism in South Africa. So to unpack how it started, to unpack how colonialism had reared its ugly head in South Africa, and of course the change that it would make in going ahead and bringing the suffering of so many groups, especially that of the black Africans, our discussion will be that today. So let me welcome in my guests. I have Professor Kealeboga Mapunye. He's an African politics professor, at UNISA, and also Mr. Thomas de Blanche. He is a historian lecturer at the Nelson Mandela University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on ITV Networks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faraz, and thank you for inviting me, and good afternoon to your viewers at home.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. And Professor Mapunye, I am going to start with you. That day in 1652. Now, there will be a lot of contrarians who would say that, well, this brought about a technological revolution within South Africa. But many tend to forget that at the time, the Khoisan had technology of their own. Many forget that there was tribes who lived in harmony and were able to be self-sufficient. Just give an idea of how this changed the moment the Dutch East India entered South Africa.
Faraz, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a very important and highly significant, topic in terms of a number of angles. Firstly, the significance of this month. We are in what is in the South African, calendar called a Freedom Month, which is April, based on the 27th of April, 1994, which we can never forget as South Africans, as it marked a serious, a very important milestone, from the era that you have just referred to, that one of colonialism. Secondly, we also have just had a Human Rights Month, previously in March. The very human rights that were denied during these eras that we will be discussing. So it's a very, very important topic. And lastly, many South Africans sometimes, and I'm glad that we have Mr. Blanche, our historian, because he will, be able to give us the historical, significance of these milestones that we talk about. In fact, the importance of history in the liberation of South Africa, as well as the negative effects of distorted history, which is also very important throughout the era when colonialism and all these other eras were enforced in our system, and the fact that sometimes we overlook the importance of history. Or the historical significance of all these events on our current situation. We only look at 27 April 1994 and we say, well, we have 26 years of political independence. And why have we not changed? Why are we having all these serious problems? Forgetting that we have had centuries upon centuries of historical things that have happened that we will unpack this afternoon. Thank you for this very topic. Now, in my view, that in fact, we should not just forget that it is not only colonialism there is a whole battery of issues for us, in my view, and my colleague will unpack this, help me to unpack these things. There's, the so-called colonialism of a special type, which, as one of the liberation movement called it, the settlers from Holland, the Dutch settlers, from the Dutch East India Company. Ostensibly, they were looking for a garden, just to plant some fruits and vegetables for their so-called halfway station to the east. We remember when we talk about such topics, the song of Hugh Masekela, Vasco da Gama, the sailor man, which brings me to the fact that it wasn't just that ship of Jan van Riebeeck for us. The Portuguese had already passed there, and they were also salivating when they passed via the Cape, putting on their flags and so on, and just thinking about taking over that land, before Jan van Riebeeck. So we need to look at this thing in a whole totality before the Dutch arrived, Jan van Riebeeck himself, and of course, what happened since then. The impact or the effects of that landing has brought about so many serious implications, ramifications for us as South Africans and the current South Africa. So I'm just trying to lay the groundwork to say that, yes, Jan van Riebeeck, but remember, it was not only just him. There were others who arrived there, and they also had their own shenanigans down in the Cape. But apart from that, it's also not only one ship. We have this was drummed down, in our history syllabus. Goede Hoop, Dromedaris, Regen, the three ships, the three infamous ships, in my view. When they landed down in the Cape, and of course they brought all these settlers, which settlers were suffering from scurvy, some of them. But when we were taught the syllabus, we were told that no, they were actually, they caused us, and the poison people were stealing cattle from the Dutch. We were wondering, but if these people were suffering from scurvy, meaning that they did not have fresh fruits and fresh meat, how come now suddenly they had meat? And in the Cape, where did they get the meat from? So our apartheid teachers were always telling us not to question things like this, about the fact that these people were suffering from scurvy, but at the same time, no. Now suddenly the indigenous Khoisan people were stealing cattle and stealing all these things, the property from them. So I will stop there. But for me, the importance of linking the colonialism, the settler colonialism, the slavery, the racial segregation, all the way up to apartheid of 1958, just recently. There's a very serious, important link that we need to thread, that we need to follow when we discuss this topic.
Mr. Tablanche, I want to bring you in. And what Professor Mapunya is mentioning, of course, what we were taught in school. Now, to quote a media colleague, Eusebius Makeza, when he says, first generation guinea pig in the Model C schools, I was one of them. And of course, being taught by white teachers, we were taught that, well, Jan van Riebeeck came and everything was lovely and beautiful and there was nothing wrong with the settlers. And we see that in pictures, but it was a completely different story when you start learning the true roots of history of what had happened at the Cape Agulhas when they did arrive.
Yeah, look, history has various voices, as it were. And I'm also what would, I suppose, some people would consider a born free. And even my earliest learnings of history before I actually became a professional historian was very much the praising of a Jan van Riebeeck, etc., who had brought some form of civilization within South Africa. We do know, thankfully, that the conversation around history and the conversation around the history of South Africa has changed over the last couple of decades or so. So the various viewpoints, which was, I suppose, introduced prior even to sort of a Bantu education period, we have a settler viewpoint of history, which sees the British as the be-all and end-all, as it were, the bringers of civilization within this particular part of the world. And then we have a nationalist Afrikaner form of history, which purports a couple of lies, like the empty land theory, which states, I suppose in short, that the land was empty and that the Nguni people had arrived the same time the first Europeans that settled here in South Africa, and there was empty land, as it were. This was a general sort of theory around a whole lot of colonial powers at the time, not only in South Africa. And so the viewpoint wasn't only sort of propagated in South African history, but also in different parts of the world. In Australia, Australia has a big so-called empty land theory, and of course the Americas as well, and India for that matter to a certain degree. So it's really the need to review history, and I think we have been able to do that over the last couple of years, at least at an institutional level. Of course, that needs to filter through to the rest of South Africans. I'll use a simple example, a simple personal example, as it were. Now, some would argue, and whether it's true or not, that I, as a so-called colored person, in fact, we need to debate what the term actually means, even and how that changed over the person, especially from the Eastern Cape region, as some sort of Khoi or San influence in me. So part of my ancestors were undoubtedly Khoi or San. Having looked at my great-grandparents' photographs, I'm certain that there was Khoi influence in that. But if one were to say that 10, 15 years ago to a so-called colored person, they would get offended in certain degrees because the Khoi and the San, according to this particular historical disposition, was uncivilized, that they did not have a culture, that they did not have a religion, that they did not have a language, that they brought no civilization to humanity. There's a strong history of this, of dehumanizing people who were not who were indigenous to the area. I mean, the earliest so-called mixed race people were called bastards. Gebaster, they were mixed people. They had to assimilate into a dominant culture, which was Dutch culture. Kretua, or Eva, as she's known by the Dutch, was the first person who had converted to Christianity, or a Protestant Christianity, or Calvinist rather, Christianity at the time, to assimilate into the culture. She adopted the Dutch language, for an example. But not many of us tell us her ability, or history doesn't tell us, or school history didn't tell us that she had a great ability to negotiate, that she had a great ability to learn new languages, for an example. She was a great linguist. Uncle would often, who was understood as Harry the Strandloper, who himself was also a brilliant individual and is understood as the first so-called freedom fighter. In fact, Madiba calls him the first freedom fighter, and he is jailed in Robben Island. I think the first person to get jailed in Robben Island. The point is that how do we view history, and how does that view of history shape our identity? How is it that 250 plus years later that a group of people, and I'm saying this of course in inverted commas, would not want to recognize their ancestry because it was taught to them that they were an uncivilized group of people? The positive is that is changing. The positive is that there has been, and I'm just using this as an example, the positive is that there has been a desire to decolonize. I mean, that's sort of a popular term and has become a very much popularized term again, in especially in university spaces, but I think it's definitely trickled down to other spaces in society. And in fact, even before the so-called 2015, 2016 Fears Must Fall and Rose Must Fall movement, again, the Khoi and San groups of people had started recognizing their identity again. So I'm incredibly excited about a group of people, a group of South Africans who see their humanity, who would want to pick up, I suppose, the languages of their past. They'd want to understand their ancestral background. They'd even want to change names that suits their lineage, like Kariga and other names which are currently being under review in this part of the region, the Eastern Cape region. So yeah, yes.
Well, Mr. Tablanchu and Professor Mapunya, we will be continuing the conversation after this break. Welcome back to Truth to Power. We are discussing 369 years after Jan van Riebeeck and the Dutch East India Company had arrived in South Africa and how it changed the face of the country forever. Professor Mapunya, one of the most interesting facets about what had happened was, of course, the changing of South Africa from a land perspective. And of course, we saw that happening for the next 300 years. The various acts that would be implemented by the British monarchy and ultimately also, effected by the National Party of its time in making sure that land was restricted to blacks, Indians, coloreds, and other races besides that of white. But how did it change immediately when Jan van Riebeeck had come? Because we learned that, of course, the development of land by the Dutch East India Company had slowly pushed away the Khoisan at that time and made it even more difficult for them to pasture crops, to farm their cattle, things that they have been doing for centuries.
It's a very complex network of issues that took place. My colleague has just referred to what was then called the Strand Europeans. These are the Khoisan people, who were essentially occupying that space that we now refer to as the Western Cape and parts of the Eastern Cape, to some extent the Northern Cape. Those three provinces at least. And because of that, the British, but maybe starting first with the Dutch themselves, they slowly and craftily and very, very brutally, one must say, because this is where gunpowder was used, this is where the military force was used. This is where, all kinds of artillery and firepower was used, to subdue the indigenous people. Let me use the term. Both the Khoi and the San, including the Xhosa and other, because it's not only just the people think it's only the Khoi, the Xhosa, and the San. There were other, smaller groups that were also staying in and around that area who were pushed away in order that land theft, let me just put it bluntly, can take place. So the land was stolen and through robbery, through the gun, essentially. And my colleague, referred to those examples of the so-called empty land theory in parts of Australia, in India, and so on. But even here, because their thinking was that, no, these people are uncivilized. And by uncivilized, what do we really mean? Did we mean that, the fact that the indigenous people had different type of technology, therefore they were uncivilized based on what? And this is where colonial thinking, European thinking, Western kind of thinking, permeates the so-called sphere of knowledge, whereby in the end, we understand civilization, quote unquote, knowledge, we also understand any other term that we use, technology, for instance, from a Western-centric point of view. And I'm glad that my colleague has mentioned, decolonization. But nowadays, some scholars are even saying we need to go beyond decolonization. We need to go for decolonial thinking or decoloniality. Decoloniality or decolonial thinking is the one which questions, the very essence of the so-called knowledge that we have as bequeathed to us by the colonialists. And here, by the colonialists, I'm not just referring to the Dutch. I'm referring to the British that you have talked about. I'm referring to the French because you know that there were French Huguenots. I mean, we have the Huguenot tunnel in the Western Cape and other parts. And we also had the Portuguese, of course, coming in and going. And of course, in my view, when I analyze the situation, it was actually a collusion of the Western, European powers in order to subdue and oppress the indigenous, people. So they used all kinds of means to push the people away from the land and gradually to allocate themselves plots through private property. Because remember, during the time of the Khoi and the San, this private property whereby you claim to a river or a bay like Camps Bay or Kabeja, as it is not, as they are now changing Port Elizabeth to was unthinkable in terms of the usufruct rights, the land user rights of the indigenous people. They did not have that kind of private property. It was communal ownership. So one would not just come and say, this tree is mine, this river is mine, this mountain is mine, like the way the colonialists introduced when they came in with their private property and imperialism tactics. So those imperialism tactics were used to enforce what we now understand today as Roman Dutch law. Essentially, it was colonial law. And we now have that in our statutes, and we can never get rid of them because this is now part and parcel of our legal heritage. But they use that kind of system, legal system, to inform the Khoisan people as well as the other indigenous people that, listen here, you don't belong here. This is our land. It was empty when you came here. In fact, you are stealing our land. In fact, you are stealing our cattle. You are stealing our goats and our livestock. So in my view, the gross human rights violations that I mentioned earlier, as well as the land robbery and theft, stock theft, were all orchestrated by a very systematic way of pushing people from away from the land and eventually enslaving them, obviously also during the slavery era, as well as during the time of racial segregation. In fact, there was also genocide for us. We should not forget.
Yes.
Genocide in the form of the diseases, European diseases like smallpox that were suddenly introduced in the Western Cape. One might say, through by hook or crook. Because some of the Europeans, the Dutch, when they arrived there, were already infected with, this smallpox, but they were immune, sort of. And yet, the indigenous people were not immune to this smallpox. So when they were infected with the smallpox, many of them, died. And of course, it became genocide, in my view, in that case, let alone the use of the gun to also shoot them out of the Western Cape and other parts of the southern part or tip of the continent, such that eventually they end up being a so-called minority. Of course, this is where now they introduced the Cape Malay. They had to go to the east to fetch slaves because the Khoisan, through their resistance, and they were heroic in their resistance, fought wars, the so-called frontier wars, and in those wars, they were able to inform the colonialists that we are not going to take this thing, this exploitation lying. We are not going to work as slaves in your farms. In fact, we are not even going to be working there because you have taken, you have usurped our land. And therein comes, slaves from east. And hence now we have the Cape Malay and others who were introduced to the Cape, of course, also having been enslaved in their own countries from Indonesia, from Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia.
I'll be continuing this conversation. I will be going to Mr. de Blanche after the break to continue the question of how this changed South Africa from a land perspective. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. Let's continue our conversation. Mr. de Blanche, I want to come to you. Now, let's go and forward wind 250 years after, of course, Jan van Riebeeck had arrived. Professor Mapunya, of course, mentions the theft of land, the settlers just coming and saying, well, this is the land I'm going to take. But one of the most interesting aspects of South African history is, of course, the finding of diamonds and, of course, the forming of the De Beers Company. And of course, the mastermind behind this is none other than Cecil John Rhodes. When you look at what had happened there, when you look at the land development around the areas where diamonds were found, especially that of the Northern Cape, how did that take its next phase in making sure that the oppression not only took its next level, but of course the ownership of resources of South Africa had started to be in the hands of the minority?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that would shape much of the 20th century, and we're still seeing massive remnants of that in the 21st century, or democratic South Africa. Probably of most recent, if you wish, is the 2012 Marikana Massacre, and one can trace that, I suppose, at a philosophical sense, one can trace back to the diamond mining or exploration of diamond mining. The Prof mentioned something very important, and maybe I'll start off with that and then fast.
I think we've lost Mr. de Blanche there. We're going to try and get him back. Professor Mapunya, I want to come to you with regards to that until we try and get Mr. de Blanche back. Well, we think we've got Mr. de Blanche back. Mr. de Blanche, you can continue.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was saying the Prof speaks about two legal elements and legal philosophies, and I'll fast forward to that, but I think it's important that I mention this. The first one is the notion of communal land ownership. If someone didn't have land among the Xhosa people, among the Khoi, for example, it would be an ancestral responsibility to give them land, right? So what happens with the Dutch influence, and then by extension the British influence, is this legal element around private land ownership. And we see throughout history, and if we fast forward to 19th century history, the notion of the Glen Grey Act, for an example, and the notion of finding diamonds at an interesting period in history, the industrialists, or the first industrial revolution, the massification of industry, and particularly in our context, the mining industry. And so that would bring forth a whole lot of diamond and gold seekers, as it were, but these were of European descent, and they needed people to work on this newly so-called found mines. In fact, there had been pre-colonial, and if you look at like the Great Zimbabwe, for an example, and those peoples, there had been trading of mineral wealth anyway. So it's not necessarily a new thing. It's just that it gets intercepted with the first industrial revolution and the massification of mines, or let's call it the massification of mines and the creation of factories for that notion. So that happens, and we need or at least Cecil John Rhodes and company, who's a politician, by the way, and a politician and a businessman, needs a lot of workers, and so he introduces legislation such as the Glen Grey Act, for an example. So you find that in our history, we always have an intersection between politics and business, and Cecil John Rhodes perfects that in the 19th century, where he's a businessman and he's a politician and prime minister of the Cape. That would shape much of the 20th century with the discovery of gold and the massification of gold. You would have multiple companies birthed from that in the second half of the 20th century, companies that we are still sort of eating from today as a result of mining conglomerates in the 20th century. It wasn't only, so it was John Rhodes in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and the Oppenheimers, which is quite a popular, non-popular, infamous name within the South African context. That creates multiple things. It creates the migrant labor system. It creates the townships. We needed, or they, I shouldn't say we, I always use the term we, they needed workers, black men in particular, and townships were created as a labor reservoir. Today, we still have quote unquote townships as a result of these so-called labor reservoirs. We need people to work, so let's create an environment and a sort of a soft enslaving environment to get cheap labor. Again, that still exists today. There's a great sense of migration consistently, not only from people who had lived in the Eastern Cape, but all over Southern Africa, the need for workers. Those legislation then gets shaped around that in the early 20th century with labor acts that prohibit Black and so-called colored and Indian people to improve themselves in terms of a capitalist perspective within the working environment. So they can't become managers, for an example, in this particular capitalist environment. That continues again in the apartheid state with legislation around that. But not only that, the whole system is sort of formulated around a Black labor system. The education system, for an example, in the early 1900s, the educationalist leaders at the time said that so-called Blacks and colored people and others could only read up to a certain level, and so therefore their position in society is to educate them to a particular level because they don't need more of that. Hendrik Verwoerd does the similar thing and says, oh, why do they need maths? They don't need that. So that creates a generation of not only institutional trauma, but institutionalized poverty. I mean, one person once said, as an example, it's racist, in inverted commas, to travel from a so-called township to your business area because you need to take 4 taxis, 2 to go to work, 2 to go to back, because the center of business is so far from the township. Let's get them to work in our industrial areas, but let them not live near us, as an example. So that was the thinking around the formation of townships, the formation of major capital in South Africa. And that, of course, then impacts generations to come and will most likely impact generations to come. Yeah.
Professor Mapunye, before we go to the break, I just want to turn the question to exactly what Mr. de Blanche was saying, migrant labor. This is no different to what we, of course, saw during the time of Cecil John Rhodes, during the time of the legislation that was passed by the National Party, to that of Jan van Riebeeck, and of course, the following colonialists that would come in, the British, that the more we push away the indigenous people from their pasturing or from land that can bring them much more wealth, the better it will be for us. It was a sense of history repeating itself from 1652 onwards up to, of course, the leading up to apartheid.
Absolutely. I think we can trace many of the effects of this migrant labor system all the way up to capitalism and imperialism. Capitalism and imperialism, in a sense that you cannot talk about private property down in the Cape, you know, as brought in by the Dutch, as enforced by the French and the British, Empire, in not only in the current Western Cape, or what was then the Cape, as well as in Natal later. But you all have to look at this system as creating a different economic system and a different economic way of living, whereby the communalism that we talked about earlier and the communal ownership of anything, whether it is water or whether it is the fruits of the valley and so on, that are found in and around a particular location, are then controlled through a capitalist system which says you shall not just have things without paying for them. We need profits. Profit comes in, and because you need a profit margin, once you start talking about the legacy of the likes of Cecil John Rhodes and the imperialists who were pushing this system of owning minerals, all the way to the Oppenheimers, as my colleague has mentioned, therein lies the roots of private property and capital, which in its nature, in my view, contains the seeds of exploitation. So we've got exploitation of man by man, but in the South African situation, because now you have this so-called melting pot of cultures, the Malays, Cape Malays, you've got the Khoisan people, you've got the Xhosas and the so-called Bantu, tribes, as they call them. ethnic groups, in my view. Then other people coming from outside, of the territory that is currently now known as the Republic of South Africa, places like Malawi, all the way to Tanzania, the former Tanganyika, Mozambique itself, Botswana, Namibia, Angola. All these people coming here, presumably or ostensibly looking for a way of making wealth, but only to find that as soon as they arrive here, in the mines in Kimberley and in the Witwatersrand, the current Johannesburg, they are enslaved and they are ensnared in this capitalist web, which just creates two classes: the oppressor and oppressed, the exploiter and the exploited. Which means that at the end of the day, democratic South Africa in 1994 inherited, this kind of system. The former president, Thabo Mbeki, once talked about the fact that South Africa, when during his time, consisted of two nations, the so-called two nations theory. And he was vehemently criticized, especially by, many in the white society. Say that, no, how can you divide? We are now having a rainbow nation and so on. But I tend to agree to some extent with, that his conceptualization, because that is the only way you will understand why we have slums. Talking about the townships that Mr. Tarablanche was talking about, we still have slums today, In the olden days, we used to have slums in places like Ketomano and so on, Crossroads, and with these forced removals all the time. But actually, they came across because the detritus, which is remnants of the capitalist exploitation, requires that these slums must be there because it requires to exploit labor. And because it requires to exploit labor, you will forever be having an army of the unemployed, a small army of the employed that are getting peanuts, and in order to generate the system. That's how the system lives. Unfortunately, when democratic South Africa came into being, it did not go so far as to change fundamentally the economic system, which also translates into the political system, which translates into the economic system as the socio-legal system, as I mentioned, the cultural relations. They remain largely the same. The only difference between what happened then and now, for instance, if you look at the migrant labor system, there's no enforcement, there's no past law or IDs that were required from colours and other groups during the days of apartheid, to say if you don't have an ID, which was specifically made for colored people and for Indian and so on, then you cannot live in the particular locality. All these battery of laws that were created between 1948 and 1993 actually sought to enforce this exploitative system, and thereby using racial discrimination, unlike in other parts of the world where it was just basically capitalism or imperialism, at its basic form. In the South African context, it had to latch onto racial discrimination as well as racial disparities, and thereby accentuating some racial groups to superiority, whereas other racial groups were, relegated to the bottom of the rank, particularly, Black Africans who were said to be at the bottom of the social ladder. So hence now, during the apartheid era, it was not unthinkable to find Mtimkulu trying to pass himself or herself as a colored person so that they can be a grootboom and get an ID, which he is now going to declare him or her a colored person, and by thereby elevating him or her a slightly higher level from the bottom of the rank. And yet those who were declared removed from Indian and colored identities and pushed to the bottom as declared as Black Africans felt the wrath of the system, because this is where the worst form of exploitation was taking place.
Professor Mapunye, unfortunately, Professor Mapunye, unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop here, but we are going to come after the break to wrap up the conversation. Stay tuned to Truth to Power. Welcome back to Truth to Power. We are going to be wrapping up our conversation with regards to 369 years after the first settlers had arrived in South Africa. Professor Mapunye, what was interesting, what you mentioned earlier on, of course, at the beginning of the discussion about a genocide that had happened. And we saw genocide happening in South Africa with regards to the effects of colonialism. It didn't only hit South Africa, it hit parts, of course, in the Congo Basin when King Leopold wreaked havoc on the Congolese people. We saw the French, what they did to the Algerian Berbers. We then move across to, of course, the Aboriginal people in Australia. We go to what had happened with the natives in America. Genocides and colonialism are hand in hand. Do you feel that accountability has still not been used with regards to holding those who had did what they had done during those years? Because it seems as if stuff like the Truth and Reconciliation and whatever committees come up, it should just be wiped away. Surely that is a thinking that we should not just leave behind.
Absolutely. I believe that the so-called Western powers, the European nations, which in their different ways, at the 1885 Berlin Conference, we must not forget that conference, even though this was long after the arrival at the Cape of Jan van Riebeeck. But the Western powers, the European powers then, Bismarck and them had already, decided to parcel many parts of the world, especially Africa, into fiefdoms, basically properties of the monarchies that were existing then, the French monarchies or the French government, the Portuguese, the British, and so on. So the subdivision and the parceling of land at the Berlin Conference, in my view, means that today, in 2021, we should actually, as Africans collectively, I don't know why the AU is looking at this, because from time to time, whenever we communicate with our colleagues at the African Union, we bring to the fore issues such as this, that, by the way, we suffered from slavery as the African continent. We suffered from not only apartheid, settler colonialism, but we also suffered from capitalism of a European type. So these countries, in my view, I think they need to pay reparations. And I know that because of the imbalance of political power in the world, currently we have the Western powers holding the sway. We've got the USA, obviously, as the only superpower after the demise of the Soviet Union. So whenever you talk about reparations, some of our colleagues, who are very critical of what happened during slavery, racial discrimination, racial segregation, apartheid, and so on, are not so keen on pushing these countries to account. So in my view, to answer your question, the short answer to your question is that, yes, I believe that there is a need for accountability, but it has not come forth. And the jury is still out there for all Africans, not only in South Africa, to push these countries to pay reparations. You mentioned all these other countries, the Congo Basin and so on. I thought you were going to mention this former so-called Southwest Africa, which was Namibia. Namibia, in fact, have already done that. They've gone to Germany, to Berlin, to challenge the German government, to say that actually the Nama people, as well as the other indigenous people, the Herero and so on, they suffered from German colonialism, and we demand reparations. We are not asking for them. We demand reparations. And for as long as it is only the Namibians speaking like that, they will remain a lone voice. So I believe that, as Africans, there is a need for us to pursue that agenda and to support not only the Namibians, but other people in the so-called former Belgian Congo and other parts of the continent to follow up on this matter. Yes, we can have truth and reconciliation, but in my view, it has to be truth, reconciliation with reparations.
Mr. Blanche, to wrap it up with you, as Professor Mapunye mentions, accountability needs to happen. Yes, you can have truth and reconciliation, but reparation needs to happen. There are currently monarchies still in existence in and around Europe. Britain, of course, Belgium, Spain, countries who, of course, really went ahead and wreaked havoc with colonialism. In your view, Mr. de Blanche, how does the African Union, as Professor Mapunye mentioned, go ahead and say, well, now is the time for you as the European conglomerates or European, nations to go ahead and pay that reparations to families who have long suffered through colonialism?
Yeah, I think again, I'm agreeing with the Prof that it's a necessary thing that needs to be actualized. I'll start off by asking if the European powers, I think we should start there because they should be held. They should be taking the initiative, as it were, to create some forms of reparations. So they need to take responsibility. We should, yes, Africa and African leaders should, of course, strengthen their voice. But there's a definite need for European powers. Are they interested in doing that? I don't think so. They do hold, like the Prof again said, they do hold the powers, as it were. They've got the World Bank under their wraps. They've got other financial institutions under their backs. They've got the G12 and the G9 in the UN Security Council, for an example. They play a key role. The US, of course, is still seen as a global hegemon when it comes to that. So I don't think the West is as interested because it would be massive reparations, as it were. Africa needs to unite. I think former President Mbeki, in his attempt to form the AU would start the beginning of that particular process. And so I think perhaps in short, I mean, we've seen what happened with Zimbabwe. I know the Prof mentioned about Namibia now, but Zimbabwe, although there have been many issues there, and we can debate that for a long time, in the early 2000s, there was a push for reparations there, and then there was multiple, what's the word I'm looking for, sanctions against it. Although, of course, that deserves a debate within itself, so I'm not saying it's just black and white. So the point is, I'm saying is that Europe and European powers and European leaders need to at the very least, return back our diamonds from that crown, as it were. Something simple like that, but they themselves don't have the political will. And the Africa needs to unite, African leaders need to unite, but they also need to strategically position themselves in the world, and that would mean better their economic situation. Because although it is a moral debate, we can't leave out the economic power that comes with a particular debate. And so once we've centered our power economically, we can, I think, have a stronger push for the moral return of the moral debate, as it were. Sorry for the lack of words here. But yes, so basically get your economy right, and then fight for the moral fight. But Europe needs to take responsibility.
Gentlemen, I wish we had more time to go ahead and continue this conversation, but of course, we will be talking about this in another time, hopefully with much more better results for those who, of course, suffered through colonialism. My guess, of course, for today, really two great learned people, Thomas de Blanchet, history lecturer at the Nelson Mandela University, and Professor Kialepuga Mapunye, an African politics professor at UNISA. Gentlemen, I thank you so much.
Thank you, and all the best to the fast.
Yeah, thank you so much. Much appreciated. Well, there we go. The question we have to ask ourselves is, 369 years after the arrival of the Dutch East India Company, have we still seen results that have a bad effect on those who have suffered with regards to ancestors? We see still that many people are looking for land that was taken away from colonialists and have still not been returned. Of course, we have laws, we have legislations that need to, of course, make sure that, Section 25 of the Constitution, like land redistribution without compensation, does happen. But these are important facts in making sure that the past crimes of apartheid can be erased, and those people who suffered through it can go ahead and have their fair share of the land and going ahead and producing and contributing to the economy. Well, we will see you again for Truth to Power next week. Ramadan Mubarak to all our viewers at ITV Networks. And don't forget to tune into the channel for more Ramadan programs and Ramadan specials. For myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the Truth to Power team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.